In this video, I'm going to show you how you can weave 4 mug rugs at the same time, all on one loom. So let's get started. All right, so I'm starting off with our large flat pack frame loom, and I'm quickly just going to go over the measurements so that if you have a different loom, you can do this on a different loom as well. So our total weaving width is approximately 13 inches. Our weaving length is about 18.5 inches, a little bit under. So I'm gonna start off with some 8/8 cotton for the warp, and then I'm using just some dishcloth cotton for the weft for these. And I'm gonna do 4 different mug rugs, all just one plain color. So this is gonna be a super easy project as well, and definitely beginner friendly. I'm gonna be using a piece of 2-inch cardstock at the very bottom of this for something to beat down onto. I'll get more into that later, but I definitely wanna make sure that I'm gonna get both of the warps for the mug rugs on this same cardstock. So I'm just kind of placing it onto my loom just to see where I should start. So I'm gonna start by creating an overhand knot. So I'm creating a loop and then doing an overhand knot. So now we have our loop. So I'm gonna put this loop onto the 6th peg. Then I'm gonna go up, and now we need to count the spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 as well. And I'm gonna go up to the 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now we do want a double warp for this. That's gonna give us a fuller fringe, but we're gonna do this a little bit differently than some of the other ones I've shown you in the past. So we're gonna come back down and go into the next space next to the loop. Actually, it kind of shares the space with the loop. Then I'm going back up, and now is where we will start our double warp. So now I'm going to be putting 2 strings between each notch. So we're not wrapping all the way around the loom, just around the pegs. We do want an even amount of strings for our warps because we will be weaving the majority of this with a plain weave that goes over 2 warp strings, under 2 warp strings. Now I'm being careful not to make this super tight because plain weave always tightens up your warp quite a bit. So I wanna make sure that it's gonna be tight enough that we can weave on it comfortably, but not so tight that it's gonna be a pain to weave on as well. So a standard coaster is usually around 3.5 to 4 inches wide. We're gonna go a little bit beyond that. We're gonna go about 4.25 inches wide because we can in this case. So I'm grabbing my measuring tape and I wanna see how far I've gotten. This almost looks like it might just about be there. Yeah, so we're at about 4 inches now. So I'm gonna go a couple more wraps. That looks good there. So I will count these strings for you so that you can just know the amount of strings. So I have a total of 34 warp strings. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut this end off, leaving a nice long tail so that I can easily tie a knot here. So I'm just kind of holding that tension while I tie the knot. This does kind of cause, as you can see, this far warp string to come out a little bit more, but that won't matter as we go. And then I can cut off some of the excess just so it doesn't get in the way. So now that's the first warp, and now we're gonna create the second warp. So once again, I'm folding over my warp string, tying an overhand knot to create a loop. And then I had way too much extra warp string here, so I'll just cut this off right away. So now we're gonna use our cardstock here to again make sure that we're gonna have enough space on it. So I don't need to leave a ton of space. I'm basically gonna be starting on the very middle section. So I'm gonna count again from the side in to make sure that we're going up to the same space. 1, 2, 3, 4, 25. 1, 2, 3. So basically there's a gap of about 6 grooves between the warps. This doesn't really matter. You can leave as little or as much space between them as you can. I'm just trying to make sure I can use this one piece of cardstock across both warps. So just like the first one, I'm gonna double warp this and we'll do the same amount of warp strings, which is a total of 34 warp strings. So I have both of my warps on, and now I'm gonna tape down my loom so that it doesn't move around. And then next we're gonna grab this piece of cardstock. So mine is about 2 inches tall. This is a little shorter than I normally use, but to space these out the way that I want to, 2 inches is gonna work the best. So I'm gonna weave this in over 2, under 2. And we're just sliding that all the way down to the bottom. This just gives us something super straight and firm to beat down the weft onto so that we know that the bottom of these coasters are straight. So I picked these 4 colors for my coaster. So I'm going to do 1 of each. These are going to be plain color coasters. So this is a really beginner friendly project, but you can do any color combination that you wish. Whether that's 1 color, 2 color, 4 color, whatever you want. And I will link the tools and materials in the description box below. So to start off, I typically like to only use about 3 arms lengths at a time. And that's just a personal preference of what I find to be manageable because I weave with a tapestry needle. So I'm gonna grab my tapestry needle and thread this in. So to start the coaster, we're going to weave over 1 string, under 1 string. Even though I'm not gonna be doing a twining stitch, I do want something that's a little bit tighter than the main portion of the coaster is gonna be, so that when we take this off the loom, it's not gonna wanna get really loose on us. The reason I'm forgoing the twining stitch is it is a little bit tedious on this double warp, and I want to knot the fringe this time, so we don't really need the twining stitch in order to do that. So I'm gonna start off with 2 rows of just regular plain weave. So that's over 1 string, under 1 string, all the way across the loom. You can see I'm just starting on 1 warp for now because we do still have to weave 1 coaster at a time, but this batch working does make making 4 of them a lot faster. So we want to create that nice big arch. You can strum your warp a bit to kind of spread it back apart and then beat that down. So that's our 2 rows of plain weave. And now we're gonna start going over 2, under 2. So this is gonna be one of those ones where you're not really gonna see the warp throughout the majority of the coaster. So from here, I'm gonna go over 2, under 2, over 2, under 2, all the way across. These kind of coasters are a really great way to practice your edges because we do wanna make sure that we're staying nice and straight with those edges. I mean, on any weaving, but when you're doing plain weave, it kind of gives you more of an opportunity to do that. So I ended going over, so I'm gonna start going under for the next row so that it wraps around the warp. And I'm just gonna keep going until I run out of yarn, and then I'll show you how I switch the yarn when I run out of it. So you can see when I'm going around the edge, I'm not gonna pull in like this. I'm gonna try to always make sure that this warp is still going really, really straight, so I'm not pulling it really tight. I can pull it tight like this and then sort of pull it back out and then create my arch, strum my warp, and beat that down. Okay, so I'm at the point now where I'm basically don't have a ton of yarn left. I probably could have done 1 more row, but that's okay. So I'm just gonna leave this hanging here. The first thing I'm gonna do is just grab another piece of yarn. So once again, working with about 3 arms lengths at a time. And there's a couple different ways you can do this. Since we're using the same color, we could actually end this in the back. So if I just remove this a little bit, and I'm gonna leave this hanging so it's going over, this piece of yarn is going over these 2 warp strings. So the next thing would be under these 2 and then over these 2. So I'm gonna fish my needle back here. We're gonna leave a tail in the back. So I've got a few inches there. And then I would go over, under. Then we don't have any ends on the side. We're just gonna have them a little bit in. So now I can just keep weaving. And then at the very end, once I'm done weaving all of these coasters, we'll tuck in all the ends. Okay, so I'm almost done this first coaster, and I need to do the plain weave on the top the same way that we started the bottom. So I've been weaving the over 2, under 2. Now I'm going to be going back to over 1, under 1, or in this case, under 1, over 1. So because I'm coming over these 2 warp strings, I'm just going to go under 1, over 1, under 1, over 1. And I'm going to do 2 rows of that so that we're ending the same way that we started. So sometimes what I like to do when I'm doing such a tight plain weave like I just did, you can actually use the tip of your tapestry needle just to sort of push it down a little bit more. And then we also want to make sure that that's looking straight. And I'm going to do one more measurement of this to make sure that it is that 4 1/4. It's slightly over, so I'm going to try to push that down just a hair more. So now we have our 4 1/4 there. So I can cut off this end. I'm gonna leave a nice long tail again, just kind of let it hang out in the back for now. And then I'm gonna move over to this side to start this coaster. And I'm gonna do this the exact same way for all of them. So I'm gonna weave this one now, and then we'll move on to the top 2. All right, so we're all done and we need to tuck in all these ends. You can see the whole purpose of using a twining stitch is so like this doesn't happen. You can see that it's coming loose. But again, because I do want to knot the ends, I thought, why don't we try this? But already I can tell you that twining is just a good idea in general, but we're gonna try it this way because there is more than one right way to do this kind of thing. There's nothing wrong with the way that I did this. It's just that the twining stitch is always gonna hold things in a little bit better than just a plain weave. So in the middle, I did end up with about 4 1/2 inches, which is not a bad thing. Just gives us a little bit more. Oh, that's funny. So I kind of miscalculated in some ways. So down here, I've got more like 2 1/2 inches. And here, I'm actually gonna only have, I'll have 2 1/4, which isn't too much less, so it should be doable, but that is getting a little bit short, just so you're aware. You can, you know, again, hopefully learn from my mistakes. If this ends up being really hard to do the overhand knots, you might wanna go ahead with the twining stitch and using just the actual warp string, just cut flush, and that's that. But I digress. We're gonna flip this over and we're gonna work on the backs. The nice thing about these particular mug rugs, because they're all one color, there's not a ton of ends to tuck in, which is something I'm a huge fan of. So we basically have 2, 4, we have 6 for each of them, which isn't bad. So I have this little metal yarn needle. This is what I'm gonna use to tuck in the ends. So let's work on the green one together because I think that one will be the easiest to see. So because we ended these back here, I do want to bring this one this way and this one that way, because if it was actually woven that way, that's what would happen. And if we pull them apart this way, you can see that there's kind of a gap. So I'm going to thread my little needle here. And I'm going to bring this one over to here. So we're going over here and then I'm going to go through this channel and I'm only grabbing loops on the back. You can do however many you want. This is overkill, but we have lots of space, so why not? And then don't pull really tight on that. After you have it in place, I like to use a smaller pair of scissors for this, but you can use any scissors. Then we're gonna just trim off that end and it sort of disappears into the weaving. We'll do that again with this one. And a really great way to thread needles like this, take your yarn, fold it over, and then squish it between your fingers like this, and then shove it through. I just always find that's easier than trying to get all the little strands through. So this one we're gonna bring the opposite way. So I'm through this channel here. Again, not pulling it tight, and trimming off the end. Then up here, Now, when I take this off the loom, I'm gonna have to be careful not to let this line get not straight because I didn't do that twining stitch. I probably just should have. But again, you don't have to. If you're someone that's like, I hate doing twining on a double warp with this thin yarn, you don't necessarily have to. It just makes your life a little easier at the end. So for this one, I'm gonna go through this little loop here and then down through this channel. And again, because we don't have a ton of ends, you can go way far down there if you're feeling a little bit paranoid. And I mean, it's great to have them through more of those loops for things like washing, so it doesn't like want to pull out because it's through quite a few of those loops. And then I'm gonna do that exact same thing with the rest of these. So for this one, again, anyone's out in the middle, I'm gonna just put them the opposite direction, tuck them in, and then the end one I'm gonna tuck in through the same way. And we're gonna start finishing this. So I'm gonna take out this cardstock. I'm thinking we're gonna start on each end and then do the middle. So for this first end, I'm gonna take off 2 loops. This is where we have to decide how many we're knotting together. Let's try 4 strings total at a time. And I think that'll be good. Just might be a little bit trickier on the center on these ones because they're gonna be a bit shorter. Okay, so you can see here we have 6 strings instead of only 4. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna do 2 groupings of 3 at the end. I think that'll be the best way to make it look even. So we'll do 1 group of 3 and then another. So it does mean that those end knots aren't quite as big, but I do think doing 3 and 3 is at least a little less noticeable than doing 4 and then all of a sudden we jump up all the way to 6. So that's how I'm kind of solving that issue. So that's what the ends are gonna look like, and then we will cut them evenly later. So let's move over to this end next. And this is where it's gonna be helpful to have like a book or something on top. And we might as well actually just slip this off. And then I'm gonna set a book here. Now on this one, because we have where we started and ended the warp, we actually naturally have 3 strings together. So I can grab this one and then these 2 together and knot those together. And then I can move on to having 4 strings until the other end. All right, so now we're ready to do the center parts. I'm gonna just make sure that's tight there. Now, I do want to make sure that this is going to be fairly centered. You could definitely draw a line on this if you want to go that far to make sure. I, as per usual, am just going to guess and hope for the best. It's kind of like one of those good enough things. So I'm going to start off this one by going 3 at each end and then 4 for the rest of the ones in the middle. Now these ones are a little bit short, but still very doable. But you can see how it's kind of coming loose there. Again, that's where that twining stitch would have been helpful, but I was feeling, honestly, a little bit too lazy to do that today. Okay, knotting the 4 strings is a little trickier, a lot trickier. Is there a better way to do that? So yeah, the overhand knot is a little trickier on this part. This was a little bit shorter than I thought it would feel. So I would probably recommend that you just weave your coasters maybe a little bit shorter so that you can have more string if you are using the specific loom from our shop that I am. Cause yeah, this is a little bit, it's a little bit tricky. Shoot. Okay, I know this is a little bit gross, so look away if you want to. But what I just did, and you could use just a glass of water too, is I just kind of wet the ends a little bit so that they would stick to each other better, and that's helping me do the knots more. So just pretend this is water if you are grossed out by that. I'm gonna just throw another tip at you right now. If you're watching this, Hopefully you haven't started yours, but I think if I did this again and I had such short strings, I would just go ahead and only knot 2 at a time. That would have been a lot better. Or again, utilize that twining stitch and just cut it off and brush out the fringe, the warp string, and use that as the fringe, because this is definitely a little tricky. Another thing that has made it a little easier is just to kind of twist all the strings together, wet the ends a bit, and that makes it a little bit more simple to get the knot tied. Okay, so I'm just gonna go back to this one and try to undo it and redo it, because you can see how much lower it's sitting. And I shouldn't have to undo it completely. I should be able to just like loosen it a little. And we'll try to just push that up a little higher. So that was that one. That was kind of hard. I'm not gonna lie, you can see I had to kind of squish it up a little bit as I went. So I'm gonna squish that, twist. I'm sure someone out there has like a trick for tying overhand knots with super short strings. I don't know what it is, but I'm kind of committed to the 4 at a time right now, so that's why I'm still doing it. Okay, I think I'm getting better at this. So definitely twisting it like this. If you're working with really short strings like I am, that helps a lot. And then just like getting those ends really tight together. I'm just finding that's made a huge difference to be able to tie those knots. So this time I'm gonna try something a little different. I'm gonna do the short ends before the longer ones because they're harder. I don't know if that'll make a difference. It just makes me feel better, so. I did it, you guys. I got all the knots in. You know, live and learn. I would say that you need a minimum of whatever this is to tie those knots, which was, yeah, that was like a good 2.5 inches. Anything shorter than that is just not quite enough. So now we need to cut these down so that they're all even. And once again, I will be eyeballing this. So we're just gonna go for it. I can measure it to tell you guys what I did, and I'm probably gonna have to, you know, even this out yet. I do want to keep those fairly short just because we don't need to have them unnecessarily long. So from the top of the knot to the bottom of this little fringe is about 3/4 of an inch for your reference. And then I can just flip this over and use that as a reference. And I'm just gonna keep using this one as my reference just so I'm always going with the very first one that I did. Here are all the coasters finished together. And because I know lots of people are gonna ask me this, the width of these is approximately 4 inches, and then from fringe to fringe, about 5.5 inches long. If you enjoyed this video, check out this one next.